Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Red May. I am Sean, your host for today, your moderator. This is part two of Marxism and the capitalist state towards a new debate. This is based on a book that came out from Paul Grave last year. I cannot recommend it enough. It is chock full of excellent thought, excellent discussion, open-ended inquiry, as much as really rigorous analysis of the relationship between Marxism and the capitalist state. Today we are joined by Alyssa Baston and Rob Hunter. Rob is one of the editors of the book with Raphael Kachachurian and Eva Nanopoulos, and Alyssa is a contributor. I mentioned this last time, but I think it's worth mentioning again. Last year, many of the writers and contributors to the book project did a talk with the Marxist Education Project, a great group. You should support them, follow them in their work, and join in their discussions. But for this talk that everybody was doing, I was working in the warehouse that day, got in there first, so I got to choose what we listened to. And all my coworkers were at first not all that excited to be listening to a lecture series on a Saturday morning. But by the end of it, we were going back and forth. They were really excited by the inquiry and the questions. They were kind of animated about the Q&A section. And then we went out afterwards, got some drinks, and chatted about it. And so it's worth noting that anybody can pick this book up. Anybody can find these topics fascinating, worthwhile, and interesting to their own lives and circumstances. So I really, really recommend sharing Marxism and the capitalist state towards a new debate with people in your life. You might be pleasantly surprised by the contemporary effects by Marxist analysis on people's everyday experience. So today I'm going to introduce Alyssa and Rob. Then they're going to do some talks and presentations, followed by a little discussion between the two of them. And then we're going to break out into Q&A. Feel free to send in questions, comments, etc. through the YouTube chat. You can also send us anywhere, like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, email, text me, send me a postcard, like whatever you got to do. If it's on your mind, let us know. So today we have Alyssa Battistoni. Alyssa is an assistant professor of political science at Barnard College. Her academic work has been published in Political Theory, Perspectives on Politics, and Contemporary Political Theory. She writes frequently for publications including New Left Review, The Nation, Dissent, N+1, Boston Review, and Jacobin. Alyssa is the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Actually, we did a Red May event for this book when it came out with Alyssa here in Seattle. It was very exciting, huge turnout. Read that if you haven't yet. And her next book is titled Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature. We're also joined by Rob Hunter. Rob is a member of the Legal Forum editorial collective. His theoretical writing can be found on the Legal Forum blog, Science and Society, Yale Journal of Law and Humanities, as well as Boundary 2 online. And his polemics can be found in publications like Jacobin, Broken Rail, The Guardian, and Peste. I think Rob is going to go first, followed by Alyssa. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and let's enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Sean, and a big thanks to everyone at Red May for organizing this and all of the hard work that they've been putting into it. We really appreciate it, and it's great to be here. And thank you as well to everyone who is tuning in or who is watching the recording. And really excited to be here today, talking to Alyssa and talking to everyone else. And I think it's going to be a great discussion. So let me just begin briefly by describing not the book as a whole, but my chapter, and perhaps we'll have some opportunities to talk about the book as a whole later. But my chapter is an argument for why we should think of the capitalist state as the political form of appearance of capitalist social relations. So I argue that the capitalist state is best understood as an historically specific social form, one that is peculiar to capitalism. In other words, there's a state that we, as capitalist subjects, encounter today, and this state is not simply a particular example of a more general category, a more generic category called states in general. Instead, it's the distinctive and peculiar political form of a distinctive and peculiar form of society, a society that is characterized by and dominated by the accumulation of capital. So in this view, the state's apparent separation from what we call the economy is both real and false. It's an appearance with real social consequences, but it's also a fetishistic appearance, something that appears natural rather than as something that is constituted through concrete activity by real people acting in history. So it's a necessary illusion. It's not just a sham or a fiction. What explains this necessary illusion? What's going on with it? And what are its consequences? And why is it that the capitalist state is a state that exercises impersonal power over abstract citizens? Briefly, in my chapter, I argue that an appreciation of the state as a social form, something that gets socially constituted in history, this is something that allows us to see that it's not an instantiation of a timeless category, but instead it's the particular political form of a particular kind of society. It's the state of capitalist society. It's not the state in capitalist society. And it's not something that stands outside of capitalist production. It's not something that stands outside of capitalist social relations in general. And for this reason, I argue that the capitalist state can't be used to legislate our way out of capitalism. So before I unpack these claims and briefly walk through the steps of my argument, I do just want to say a couple things about the motivation behind the chapter. So the motivations for it rather substantially overlap with those of the volume as a whole. The co-editors and I, in the introduction, we describe how there's still a lot of currency to the idea that the capitalist state is just an instrumentality of class rule and nothing else, or that the capitalist state is merely a superstructural reflection of a productive base. And we suggest in the introduction, and it's my intuition as well, that this is an unsatisfactory way to approach the question, that it's not particularly illuminating. And so in addition to arguing against an instrumentalist view of what the capitalist state does, I'm also positioning myself against another common way of thinking about the capitalist state, which I'll call the relative autonomy thesis. So there are many Marxists who, in attempting to move beyond the base superstructure metaphor, have posited the idea that the state or the political is relatively autonomous, not fully autonomous, but relatively autonomous from the economic, and vice versa. And again, it's my intuition that this is not a sufficient explanation for what's going on. At any rate, those are my motivations. I'm happy to talk more about these perspectives during the Q&A, but let me lay out the claims in my argument. So to us right now, the state appears as something that is separate from civil society. It appears as something that is at some degree of remove from the core activities of capitalist society. And these activities are the production and the exchange of commodities. I mean, in the ordinary course of things, the state does not conscript us into participating in the production process. Instead, we participate in production because we are compelled, not by anyone in particular, but by the form of our society. We're compelled to sell our labor power. If we don't sell our labor power, we don't have money. And if we don't have money, then we can't buy the things we need to live. And the things that we need to live are only available as commodities. So there are a couple of things to emphasize about this situation. The first is that this is historically unusual. This is not how social reproduction has occurred in most societies throughout history. And second, on its face, this doesn't seem like a state of affairs where the state is involved. It really does seem as though the state is something that stands apart from our daily lives, where we go about working in order to get money. And so the first step in my argument is really to dwell on the fact that this is so historically unprecedented. A political state exercising impersonal power on behalf of a notional general interest is something that's very historically specific. It's not something that we typically see, certainly that we don't see in the epoch prior to the consolidation of capitalist social relations beginning in the early modern period. We do see class states and class societies in eras prior to our own, but it's my claim that these are not the same sort of thing as the state that we encounter in capitalist society. In fact, it's my claim that they're not just particular instantiations of the state per se. Instead, those states, as well as our states, are specific, historically specific social forms. They're socially constituted within history. They're not timeless. They don't exist outside of history. There's not some general thing called the state that is just baked into the deep structure of reality. Just like capitalist society has a peculiar form of wealth, it also has a peculiar and socially constituted and historically specific political form of appearance. So it's really only with the advent of capitalist social relations that we begin to see the exercise of public impersonal power for the sake of securing the conditions that are necessary for continued and expanding capital accumulation. And this is something that begins with historical episodes of primitive accumulation, like the ones that Marx discusses at the end of Volume 1 of Capital. These were violent episodes of the separation of the direct producers from the means of production and subsistence. But this separation persists. It didn't just happen once. It's something that gets reproduced indefinitely. And in my chapter, I talk about it being reproduced through what the late Simon Clarke called the anonymous rule of money and the law. And I think this is a really felicitous phrase, and I'm going to return to it a couple of times. So what is meant by the anonymous rule of money and the law? Well, the capitalist state reproduces the availability of commodity labor power by keeping the mass of direct producers separate from the means of production, by protecting property rights. And it upholds money as the universal equivalent that mediates exchange relations. Money is necessary for mediating exchange of commodities, and the exchange is how commodities get socially validated as having been produced through abstract social labor. So the creation and regulation of money is a core aspect of what makes the capitalist state specifically capitalist. And it is in this respect that the capitalist state is, in fact, intimately bound up with value relations. And just as fundamentally, it's the public power, the public violence of the states, rather than the private violence of individual property owners, that does most of the job of continuing to reproduce the separation of producers from production. And in this way, the state assumes a guise of being a neutral arbiter of legal disputes and of being a neutral enforcer of laws that supposedly have general applicability. So the state maintains a separation that began with historical episodes of primitive accumulation, but it's also a separation that continues indefinitely. And it has to. In order for capitalists to be able to purchase labor power as a commodity, it has to be generally available on the market. And the condition of possibility for that is the existence of a huge number of people who are separated from the means of subsistence and production. So they can only reproduce themselves by acquiring commodities, and they can only acquire commodities by getting money, and they can only get money if they sell their labor power. And it's my contention that the state is, in fact, implicated throughout all of this. It's not standing outside of it. So let me return again to Clarke's phrase, the anonymous rule of money and the law. What does anonymous mean here? Well, this rule is anonymous because it's impersonal and it's abstract, but it's also anonymous in the sense that it's second nature. In other words, the activity of the state is fetishized as something that seems natural. It's not for nothing that we regularly hear appeals to the idea of the rule of law or of maintaining law and order. And these phrases are tossed around as though they are just natural constituents of our social world. And as far as state personnel are concerned, and as far as capitalist subjects are generally concerned, the state really is just going about its natural business of defending order and upholding the rule of law. And as lots of Marxist theorists have been arguing, at least as far back as Walter Benjamin, there's no contradiction in the use of violence exceptional violence, if necessary, to maintain and construct that order. But the fetishism of the state doesn't end just with the state appearing to discharge these notionally timeless tasks. By doing these things, it also appears to be separate from society as such. So Ellen Wood aptly describes this as a real appearance. It's a real appearance in that it's a constitutive premise of capitalist society that the state appears to stand over and above it and separate from production. But this separation, as I've argued, is also a false appearance, in that the state is the capitalist state, I should say, is the state form that is adequate to the reproduction of capitalist society. And so it is very much the state of capital. It's not anterior to capitalist social relations, and it's not something that's grafted onto them. So the separation of the political and the economic, if you want to call it that, is a necessary illusion. And thanks to this necessary illusion, the state appears as a neutral arbiter of disputes, as a universal defender of the rights and privileges of capitalist subjects. So let me be clear, the capitalist state is not a class state in a way that's similar to how feudal lords enriched themselves when exercising direct power over their subjects. And it's not best understood as a state that is working directly and intentionally to the good or the benefit of particular individuals or particular class fractions. Instead, the capitalist state stands in a relationship of mutual presupposition with capitalist production, even though it appears to have nothing to do with it. Without the capitalist state's maintenance of the separation of producers from production, without it ensuring that money is the universal equivalent of the necessary mediator of exchange, then investment in the production of commodities and the pursuit of surplus value simply would not be possible. And as a result, the social reproduction of capitalism would not be possible. So for the umpteenth time, the state appears to be separate from capitalist society. It is and it isn't. So what's the payoff of this view? Well, I argue in my chapter first that seen this way, the capitalist state cannot be seized and put to use in dismantling capitalist social relations, just because it presupposes and is a premise of capitalist social relations. It's not a generic instrument for enacting any particular kind of policy. It's certainly not a generic instrument for just shaping social relations de novo. Instead, we should think of it in the terms that Marx used in the Grundrisse when he calls it the organized force of bourgeois society. And just for that reason, I also argue that we should not see the capitalist state as subordinated to capital. We should see it as the state of capital. And this isn't just pedantic wordsmithing. There are a lot of thinkers out there who do like to describe the capitalist state as subordinated to capital or as dominated by capital. And I think that the implication here is a claim that the state has somehow been denatured by capital, such that it's not functioning appropriately. It's not really acting as a state of all of its citizens. But as I've argued, we shouldn't think of the capitalist state as in any way being a state of its concrete citizens. It's the state of a notional general interest, one that can only be articulated specifically in terms of securing the conditions that are necessary for the valorization of capital. And the stakes here are theoretical, but they have downstream consequences for how we identify and understand and interpret and respond to real struggles. So in my chapter, I place a couple of quotes in opposition to each other. So on the one hand, I have a quote from the theorist William Clare Roberts, who describes the state as, quote, the armed and servile agent of capital, end quote. And then I contrast this with a quote from Werner Bonefeld, who says, quote, the state is not an agent of capital, end quote. There's a real opposition here, and it's a real point of disagreement. And I'd like to suggest that one is a better reading than the other. But this is something that we can talk about at length in the Q&A if necessary. So finally, I just want to say a few words about how the social form approach to thinking of the capitalist state as an historically specific social form, one that gets constituted through concrete activity of real social individuals, but then in turn mediates that activity. How does this stack up against other views? Well, let's return to the traditional interpretation of the base superstructure metaphor. I think that it's just not sufficient to assert, as Marx and Engels did in the Manifesto, that the modern state is nothing but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. It's a great line, but I would argue that it doesn't capture the specificity of the capitalist state, and it doesn't illuminate or really respond to the right questions. Again, this is something that I would be delighted to talk about at length during the Q&A. The other thing is the relative autonomy thesis. So this proceeds from a very common sense intuition, which is that we see a lot of variation in state policies across time and across political geography. And on the other hand, the policies enacted by the state are not infinitely variable. They do seem to be constrained to greater or lesser degrees. So according to the social form approach, this constraint on the content of the policies of the capitalist state, this constraint is a result of the particular and peculiar form of the capitalist state as a capitalist state. And I think that this is a more parsimonious way of understanding what's going on than the relative autonomy thesis, which, as I understand it, requires us to posit multiple overlapping social realities. It requires us to posit that there's something called the political, and that there's something called the economic, and that they have distinctive logics. Whereas, to borrow another phrase from Werner Bonefeld, I think that there's really only one social reality. We live in a society that is dominated by value and the accumulation of capital, and it is from that starting point that we have to try to theorize the capitalist states. In other words, the question to ask is not whether the economic has primacy over the political or vice versa. The question to ask is, given that we live in a society that's dominated by the compulsion to participate in the valorization of capital, how do we make sense of the state's seeming appearance as something that's separate and over in society? How do we go about trying to figure out what the logic of that form is? So let me sum up so that I can turn things over to Alyssa so we can hear about her chapter. The capitalist state, as I've argued, is form determined such that it rules not in the service of particular class fractions, but it rules in the name of an abstract general interest. By doing so, and in the appearance, in the guise of being a separate and neutral entity that is separate from society, it enforces, there's that phrase again, Clark's anonymous rule of money and the law, and it does so over everyone. It inscribes the law of value as the ultimate law over all classes and communities in a social world whose single and overriding purpose is the continued and expanding accumulation of capital. Thanks very much.
Okay, should I just take it away, Sean?
I was just going to jump in real quick.
Oh, right. Sorry.
And ask Rob, like, what led you to, I would say, on the one hand, like, what kind of drove you to this kind of not just social form analysis? I think I'm thinking even broader than this, right? So, like, how did you find yourself in this particular context where the state question in and among, let's say, Marxist and politicized circles kind of like got into your head and caused a little bug in there? I'm just assuming that because I read your writing. So,
thank you. I mean, I think that I mean, part of it is being a subject of this particular society that we live in. It's just hard not to immediately focus on parliamentary politics, and certainly that's how we're taught to think about the political, is that it consists of elections, and not just elections of any kind, not just aggregating the activity of lots of people, but of formal and institutional patterns of really sort of channeling and limiting the scope of what's possible politically. And so I've always just been interested in how politics is reduced, how it's made to be non-identical with itself, to made to be less of itself in a society where it's presented to us as a given that on the one hand, we're told that we are the authors of our own political destinies because through concepts like popular sovereignty, which is really not a theory of how we can go about being authors of our own destinies. And on the, I guess I've just always been sort of struck by the contradiction between the high-flown rhetoric that particularly gets used in North Atlantic democracies about freedom and possibility, and the indeterminate character of political possibility. On the one hand, with the fact that on the other hand, nothing ever changes, and we seem to be given relatively few choices, or rather, we seem to be given choices with relatively few substantive differences. I guess that's sort of like a biographical answer. I think a more theoretical answer is I should confess that this is where I've arrived at the end of a journey where I think I've inhabited all of the positions that I described in my talk at various points. And I would be really interested during the Q&A to talk about them, to hear from people who are partisans of any one of these tendencies. I think that they all respond to or capture really important intuitions, and these are intuitions that people have to form in the teeth of a society where it's a cliche to say a society where critical thought is discouraged, but I think a society where it's just really difficult to think against the grain of that society, and so there's a really great conversation to be had, and I'd like to think that where I've ended up is where I'm going to stay. That what I've presented are my considered judgments, but I'm always willing to be persuaded otherwise. But I don't want to take up any more of Alyssa's time.
You're not taking up any of Alyssa's time because Alyssa can talk for as long as she wants, and we will love to listen to that. So, excuse me. Thanks for a little journey down the personal road. We I think need to hear a little bit more from that in people in these circles. We tend to hear a lot of withdrawn political demands, and so plugging ourselves back into the world is exceptional and useful, and as it turns out, quite pleasant. So thanks for Rob, really appreciate that. Alyssa, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. And so thank you so much, Sean and Mahim and the rest of the Red May crew for organizing this and for, both this event and then the broader series on the volume. It really is gratifying, Sean, to hear that it's been, of interest to, not only to you, but to your coworkers, to people you've been talking to. I think these questions are really essential to our moment. It's really, it's exciting to see like a growing interest in state theory, and, thanks especially, to our fabulous editors, Rob and Raphael and Ava, for, mobilizing this project and sort of doing all of the legwork to bring it together, because I have certainly learned a lot from it. So I'll just talk a bit about my chapter, and then, looking forward to talking with Rob, to talking with everyone out there watching. Thanks for being there. But so my chapter is called State, Nature, Capital, State Theory for the Capitalocene, and it basically addresses some of the overarching theories of the state that Rob was just describing, but it sort of tries to think that I'm through in relation to climate change and climate politics, and kind of more broadly ecological politics in particular. And the state, I think, has been actually sort of surprisingly absent from a lot of recent work on nature and capitalism. There's been a lot of great eco-Marxist work in recent years, but the state is kind of like around the edges at best of a lot of that work. And so it seems to me like an area that we really need to, sort of think through, sort of what role this sort of, sort of this, if not an agent of capital, but a different kind of agency is playing. So this chapter in particular emerges from, it's sort of both, I think, trying to identify and think through what I think is a bit of an aporia in some of the existing literature, but it really emerges more directly from my thinking about more immediate debates about contemporary climate politics and sort of what the role of the state in those are. And so, for decades, we were in this position where market mechanisms like carbon taxes and cap and trade and things like that were kind of the dominant and in many ways really the only option on the table for, reducing carbon emissions, for climate policy. As I'm sure everyone is familiar, those approaches have been challenged in recent years by sort of, proposals that foreground more direct state intervention or action. Intervention might be overly strong, but in service of developing, mostly in terms of developing green technology. But we had, certainly calls for the Green New Deal, which I worked on and I'm happy to talk about more. But also, obviously, a lot of attention to and both calls for and some instantiations of green industrial policy. I'm not sure that the IRA here in the US even rises to the level of green industrial policy, but be that as it may, something where you have a kind of more active state role in subsidizing green tech and green capital and so on. So those kinds of proposals and debates and the shift away from like the markets only model of climate policy also sparked what I think was a very interesting and important round of debates around what we can expect from the state, like whether we can expect the capitalist state to act in ways that challenge the interests of fossil capital, whether a more substantial break with capitalism is necessary to address climate change, and like what the role of the state in that might be. I think a number of people have argued that a serious break with capitalism is necessary to avert ecological disaster, and we can't expect the capital state to deliver on decarbonization promises. More broadly, ecological thinkers have, including non-Marxists, but, ecological thinkers have long been critics of the state in their own right. They say, ecological phenomena and political boundaries don't align. There are all of these things that states are sort of not suited to doing when it comes to acting with what people talk about as like ecological rationality or ecological reason. And so we have many critiques of the state, from both Marxist ecological perspectives and eco-Marxist perspectives. At the same time, the temporal urgency of the climate crisis has presented this set of political challenges. We have obviously a very short timeline. Many of the things that seem required to cut carbon emissions are things that, only states other than capital seems capable of funding and executing at scale, whether that's regulation of carbon emissions or building out infrastructures of renewable energy or providing low carbon public goods, like, dense housing, public transportation, and so on. So we've had these sort of debates, like often more focused on the specifics of climate policy. And then my chapter tries to kind of like step back from those a bit and address some of the debates about the role of the state in climate action at a little bit higher level of abstraction, to appraise the conditions under which we might expect states to act in order to prevent capitalism's ecological crises or not. And so it basically does this by thinking through two debates in Marxist thought and putting them together. So the first is a debate about capitalism and nature amongst eco-Marxists. The second is a debate about the state amongst Marxist state theorists. And I try to kind of, again, put these debates, which I think have largely developed separately, into conversation to clarify assumptions about the relationship between state, capital, and nature that I think are often kind of implicit in arguments, but not stated as directly as they might be, in that I hope might be clarifying in some respect. I'll say just like off the bat, this is like an intentionally stylized and, schematic in places approach to these debates. It's inevitably simplifying them. So I apologize for, kind of like boiling down very complex debates and just some like pretty, basic points. But I think it's like to try to clarify some of these sort of like key ideas that are, I think at work in a lot of our arguments. So I'll just sort of go through the two debates that I look at, and then and how I put them together. So I'll start off with this first question, which I think is one of the central questions of eco-Marxism, and this is at a very basic level, what is the relationship between capitalism and nature? There are a lot of different ways to approach that, of course, but the question that I focus on in the chapter is one that I think is particularly significant for this purpose, and that's whether the question of whether capitalism's tendency to destroy what we might think of as ecological nature also constitutes a crisis for capitalism itself. So, on the one hand, we have arguments that capitalism's destruction of nature is also self-destructive, that it reverberates back into profitability and affects processes of capital accumulation. And this is sort of most significantly associated with James O'Connor's second contradiction thesis, which draws on both Marx and Karl Polanyi to theorize what he calls the second contradiction of capitalism. He says that you can get that you can have crises of capitalism not only by virtue of the overproduction of commodities, but the underproduction of the conditions of production, like ecosystems. If you underproduce ecosystems, that might lead to higher ecological costs and might reverberate back into to production itself. And that this creates a crisis that has to be resolved in some way, if it's not to sort of, to be a sustained crisis for capital. There have been similar arguments made really prominently in recent years. I think this has been a very influential thesis, and it's been, taken up by people like Nancy Fraser and Jason Moore, who have argued in recent years that capitalism's facing an apocal, potentially terminal crisis that's sort of stemming from this tendency towards ecological destruction. So that's one position. On the other, we have this a position that, yes, ecological crises are, capitalism does sort of cause these ecological crises. They're often devastating for forms of human and non-human life, but they tend not to have direct or major consequences for capital accumulation. So people like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett say, there's no feedback mechanism between ecological degradation, ecological crisis, and then economic crisis. It doesn't necessarily, you might be destroying the planet, but it may not sort of feed back into processes of capital accumulation sort of at least as immediately enough that capital has to respond. Obviously, like even capital needs a minimally habitable planet, but capital accumulation might be able to sort of continue with very high levels of degradation, ecological degradation, with what we might think of as social and ecological crises that are crises for people, for communities, for more than human worlds, but not for capital itself. And so that would mean sort of we can't rely on this sort of idea that there's inherent instability in the system, but you have to make a kind of case against capitalism on the basis of these harms to the harms it's causing in themselves. So that's one debate. Then, part two of the paper looks at this other debate, the Marxist state theory debates about sort of the relationship between capital and state. And, here too, I think, certainly Marxist state theorists tend to share many broad positions. So, pretty much everyone will critique bourgeois theories of the state. So, we can't think of the state as just like a fully autonomous institution with its own logic and ends. It's not just an expression of the popular will. It's not just a neutral terrain where interests are contesting. Instead, we have to think about the modern state as, in some way, specific to capitalist society, although as Rob has suggested that like the ways that people think about that differ. Structured by class relations, oriented towards stabilizing accumulation. States, people will say, do things that capital can't, secures private property, it mediates between capitals and so on. And so, there are, again, a lot of things we could talk about here, as with the capital nature debates, but the sort of question that I focus this like dichotomy around is basically like, the degree of political agency that exists in the view of the capitalist state, and the degree to which people think it might be possible to use the state against capital. Whether that means sort of against capitalism is maybe another question, and we can get into that too. But in any case, so here I basically draw here on Raju Das's distinction between structural and class struggle analyses, and this is also a stylized distinction, but I think it's useful for the question I'm asking around sort of like what degree of political room is there. And so on the one hand, what Das describes as structuralist accounts are ones that see the state as strongly constrained by its role in capitalist society. So, the state here is constituted by class society, by capital accumulation, such that it will not, and in some cases simply cannot, act in ways that are counterposed to the general interests of capital or oriented towards non-capitalist ends. And this view is, I think, most forcefully expressed in the state derivationist and related social form traditions of Marxist thought, including many of those which Rob has just really usefully outlined for us, wherein, basically the economic and political are these sort of are constitute a separation and unity, to quote Marx, discrete elements of capital society, but that are sort of developing out of the same underlying social relations. But there are other approaches that, although they have sort of theoretical differences, also kind of suggest a similar level of state constraint. So I think some of Nikos Poulantzas's earlier and more sort of structuralist texts do have, this quality of sort of like basically viewing even the autonomy of the state as being functional for capital in some way, and that whether or not the state, maybe the state can't succeed in all of its aims, but the state can't really be intentionally turned against capital or made to serve non-capitalist ends. So again, so important, I think, theoretical differences between these positions, but in terms of what we can expect from the state, there is at least some, I think, accordance. On the other hand, sort of what Das calls class struggle approaches, again, they share a lot of key elements with a more structuralist account in terms of seeing, there are certainly constraints on the state. The state carries out like various functions for capital and so on. But there is also sort of a degree to which the structure of the state is also affected and informed by the struggle between classes in historically contingent moments. So the state in general, or elements of it, might act in ways that don't serve either the interests of particular fractions of capital or capital in general. And so there might be sort of, policies like full employment policy that bolster workers' position against capital, that sort of advance a class struggle, whether or not they sort of are capable of, sort of fully defeating capital through the state is I think often, people have different positions on this, but there's sort of some room to move. I think I want to say these positions don't necessarily say that like any time that the state acts to advance, working class interests or proletarian interests, or other non-capitalist interests, are necessarily a blow to capitalism's viability, but there's at least this possibility that the state will act in ways that aren't directly oriented towards reproducing capital in, the short or long term. And Poulantzas's kind of condensation view of the state as a condensation of class struggle in his later work, some work by people like Bob Jessup, certain uptakes of Ralph Billenband. So these are sort of like the positions. And then in part 3, I put these debates in conversation to explore the interaction between the sort of the 3 central terms, state, capital, and nature. And here too, I think James O'Connor offers a really useful starting point. So O'Connor, in the Second Contradiction essay, he says the state mediates capital and nature such that, the conditions of capitalist production are politicized. He says every state agency and political party agenda may be regarded as a kind of interface between capital and nature. And, I don't think you have to adopt the whole, his entire theory of the contradiction, or even the claim that every state agency is an interface between capital and nature, to sort of appreciate what I think is an important point of the way that the state has a mediating function in the relationship between capital and nature. And so I kind of take up this basic idea to say our view of how the state does that is going to vary depending on one's view of A, capital's relation to nature, and B, capital's relation to the state. So based on all of this, this is sort of where this gets us is to this little, I dropped this little like 2x2 chart. Mahim, if you can pop that up there. Yeah, so I basically make this little 2x2 chart that tries to combine each of the two positions and say like, okay, here's what we'd expect if we take, if we kind of combine this XY view of capital and nature and this view of state and capital. So if we look, for example, in if we see that capitalism, we think that capitalism is not self-destructive, and that is that first sort of, the left-hand column is the sort of Burkett-Foster position that capital's destruction of nature is not self-destructive. If you merge that with a more structuralist view of the state per Dawson, we wouldn't expect state action to prevent ecological destruction, because in this case, we would see, state action to prevent ecological and social crises as, basically a limitation on capital's destructive tendencies that's not undertaken in the interests of capital, but rather that's being undertaken in the interests of human and non-human life. And that would seem implausible to us based on our understanding of the state. If we, by contrast, see, the sort of capital is socially and ecologically destructive, but not self-destructive. But we have the sort of class struggle view of the state in that sort of kind of top left position, then we would say, well, states generally are going to act in capital's interests, but there might be some room to sort of, we might expect that there might be places where the state might act, to protect people from climate disasters, even if they're not also sort of, workers for like a particular industry, or preserve unprofitable forms of non-human life, and potentially even to do so in ways that not only don't directly serve capital, but that might even in instances cut against capital's interests. And then we can kind of have like a sort of similar configuration on the right-hand side, where if you see, if you think capital is self-destructive and that the state does act for in the interest of capital, you would expect like states to take action to ward off, climate and other ecological disasters, but only in ways that are sort of serving, preserving capital accumulation, or at least that are doing that first and foremost, and that, maybe there are downstream effects for, for protecting, human life or certain ecosystems, but those will be sort of subsidiary to, or those will be like downstream from the broader goal of preserving sort of the conditions that capital needs, and so on. So, that's basically the idea of like kind of trying to break these down, and like here are the kind of four positions that we might expect based on roughly based on what view you have of the state and what view you have of capitalization in nature. Schematic and stylized, but I hope at least sort of like a rough start for thinking through what are the kinds of possibilities we might expect, again with this more abstract level. So there is, I think, interestingly, basically only one. There's really sort of like one position where we would see capital as like absolutely, because as a capital state, not only will not, but basically like just like is not going to do anything to stay off ecological catastrophes because they don't immediately threaten capital itself. But there's also kind of only one configuration in which state action to address ecological crises constitutes like a genuine challenge to capitalism, which could lay the groundwork for a more substantial eco-socialist program. Doesn't mean they're equally likely. This isn't like, oh, there are four positions, so they're each like a 25% chance. But, I think just to sort of say that this is, I think, those one, I think, significant upshot. And more generally, the chapter, and I'm almost done here, but the chapter doesn't like argue for anyone in particular. It's just trying to lay out what I think sort of the these important assumptions, ideas, kind of more like, these basically like where we might position sort of different sort of like immediate kind of the questions that Rob described as being ones of like kind of immediate parliamentary politics, or like kind of day-to-day like policy stuff, and where those how we might situate those in relation to sort of broader currents of Marxist thinking. The last thing I'll say is just that I don't make an argument for any of these, but I will say that I don't think that, in my own view, the fact that certain political projects aren't necessarily like a break with capitalism isn't necessarily an argument against them, given the exceptionally short time horizon of impending climate catastrophe, the nonlinear nature of the climate system, various sort of temporal disjunctures that attend most obviously the climate crisis, but also other ecological crises. I tend to think that buying time for anti-capitalist politics, even in ways that sort of are like in some way tenable within the system, are essential. But assessments of even the prospects for buying time will, I think, depend to some degree on like where one positions themselves within this chart. So I will leave it there for now. I've already gone on, I think, over my time, but looking forward to discussing this with everyone here and to questions and everything. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for that, Alyssa. Also, shout out to the 2x2 square, firmly in a pro 2x2 square camp.
Love it.
Yes. I would also appeal to, for example, another contributor to the book, Mike McCarthy's class paper that also spawned a great debate over 2x2 squares. So, everyone watching, look deep within your heart and soul and really figure out where your position is on this very important schematic debate or debate over schematics. Yes, exactly. Alyssa, I'm just curious, we have, when we had you out in Seattle to talk about the Green New Deal, we've had you on Red May before. And I'm a frequent reader of your work. You're one of my favorite political theorists today. So I'm curious over something, though, that I guess I haven't seen, but like kind of what drove you in your own life into this intersection towards nature and or ecosystems and capital. How did we get there for you?
Great question. Yeah. In a lot of ways, I mean, basically through like Hurricane Katrina, which is now like a long time ago. But I spent a bunch of time in New Orleans after Katrina when I was, a teenager, and was very like, that was a real, what the fuck moment of just like seeing like total state collapse and abandonment, and trying to figure out like what happened there. I think has been, how to understand this, like how to understand more broadly, like that kind of led me down a path of like realizing I needed to think about climate change. I needed to think about like the what the underlying causes and forces at work and creating this disaster. I was working on disaster for a lot at the beginning, and then I increasingly kind of got into sorry, I keep like leaning out of the screen, and then I increasingly got just like realized I had to like understand capitalism and Marx, and like that just kind of like set off a whole rabbit hole, which is a wonderful journey. But then, so in some ways, I think actually it's been interesting. I was thinking about this as I was working on like this chapter, and as I'm trying to like, I think my next book project is going to be more on like capital, climate, and state. But it feels in some ways like returning to the original questions, which were very much about like, where is the state in relation to, into the sort of destructive consequences of, of like capital driven, like climate disasters and other ecological disasters. But like I sort of, have spent most of like the book that I just am finishing now is mostly a kind of like capitalism and nature book rather than sort of state per se. But yeah, so that's sort of the very original point now, like almost 20 years ago. And I'm like, wow, that was a long time ago. Like my students are like, Hurricane Katrina? So they barely know what it was. Anyway.
I was also down there after Katrina in New Orleans and some of the surrounding parishes doing reconstruction work. At the time, I guess it'd be, or currently it'd be framed as kinds of, directed mutual aid work or whatever.
Yeah.
But
did you do stuff at the Common Ground?
Yeah.
All right,
absolutely.
common ground. Yeah,
That's
well,
crazy.
we probably were like in the same place at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. If that was the case, then you'd find this sort of like hideous loaf creature in the corner. That would be me. That was definitely me, or like on a roof or falling off a roof somewhere. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But very interesting and fascinating, and also really excited to hear about free gift coming down the lifeline right now. I'm really looking forward to that.
Thanks.
So for everybody watching, please, start sending in some questions, some considerations, whatever you got. We'll take confessions. We'll take them all. Before we get to that, though, I'd be really interested in having Rob and Alyssa have a little discussion on the one hand about their presentations today, but also having worked on this project together for a while and been talking about it for almost a year now. If there's any sort of interesting either developments or curiosities or engagements that you have on your contributions.
Yeah, definitely. I'll bite. So something that was great about preparing for this presentation was getting to read Alyssa's chapter again, and it got me thinking about word choice. So the title has the word capitalocene. I don't know where to place the accent, but capital is there rather than Anthropocene, which is often the more commonly used locution. And there have been a lot of debates about whether it's more appropriate to describe climate change arising as a result of social domination of nature as whether it's more important to just establish that it's human cause, or it's more important to say that, well, it's a specific form of human activity, which is capitalist production, and the concomitants of those particular processes. And it got me thinking, though. I don't necessarily want to add more dimensions to the chart. I'm pro chart, but I did start to wonder about, is there another, and I'm going to mix my metaphors here. Like, is there another axis, another polarity in play here, which is like, so on the one hand, like we want to position these accounts with respect to each other in terms of how they understand the capital nature relation, but also how they understand the capital state relation. Do you think that it would be fruitful also to try and arrange them in terms of how they understand specifically what it means for human-caused climate change, human-caused destruction of ecosystems to be happening in the way that they're happening? So not just sort of like theorizing nature as, is it separate or not from human beings, and if so, how? But also sort of like, is there a payoff for thinking about the specific mechanisms whereby human activity on the planet right now, as opposed to 10,000 years ago, is pushing us to the precipice? And I'm thinking here specifically about the inadequacy of really sort of like meme level arguments, like, oh, we know the names and addresses of people who are destroying the planet. It's like, we can set that to one side, but there does seem to be disagreement about how we should think about the specific mechanisms by which we as capitalist subjects are destroying nature.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there's disagreement. I think within the people I had in mind for this chapter, like, I don't know, just seeing like the major currents of eco-Marxist thought, like the kind of Bellamy Foster school, like, Koisai's work, which hadn't really kind of come out as much when I started, or at least been translated as much when I started working on this. I guess his first book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, was out. But anyway, now he's gotten 3. Mom, more the kind of like new wave of stuff, Nancy Fraser's more recent stuff, and so on. I think most of those people would agree that like it's definitely capitalism. It's like, it's not human action in general, it's capitalism. I do think that sometimes there's like some aspects of differences in the mechanisms per se, and like I think that if you want to get more fine-grained in terms of thinking about how and where what kinds of interventions you might need to make to challenge that, or what sort of specifically, for example, if you had some view that you could use the state to challenge aspects of this, like where would you push? Basically, you would need like a more specific account of mechanisms. But I think that at least within the sort of group of eco-Marxist thinkers, like I have read very few people who are saying, who like it seems like there's basic agreement that capitalism is to blame, and it's not just like some individual guy. It's like not like call up like Rex Tillerson or whoever and you like protest outside his house. I mean, you might want to do that, but it's like not because you think that he is the driving force of things. And so and I think that there are people who are kind of in the broader eco-socialist, eco-left kind of world who probably have more of that position. And I think there are people like Naomi Klein who kind of go back and will sometimes say it's like a more structural kind of like capitalism is like the problem, and sometimes we'll kind of have a more like kind of directed at particular people. And some of that I think is also rhetorical and political strategy. You're like, all right, like yes, it's very helpful to have names and addresses and to like pinpoint specific people and to point the finger and all of that, but you don't want to do it to the point where you're losing track of sort of the systems that they're operating within, and the reasons why. If you just put some other Rex in place of Tillerson, it's going to be the same. So I think that there is kind of probably a broader apparatus of like eco-socialists and eco-left and like progressive positions that are kind of around this that, I think by having some, maybe some offshoots from the chart might help flesh out a bit. And then I certainly think that like there's a ton of questions around like what you think the key thing to press on. Like I think the question, like the chapter doesn't talk that much about even like kind of splits within capital, like green fossil capital, right? Like can you have a state that's acting as I think a lot of green industrial policy is doing now, or at least trying to do, often kind of unsuccessfully actually, but to like promote sort of the development of green capital as like to compete against maybe fossil capital. There's like no disciplining of fossil capital, but it's like a the attempt to create some kind of new challenger, or at least like a new source of jobs and revenue, which may not ultimately challenge it that much. So in any case, there's I think a lot of other questions that are kind of like more specific, definitely. And so let the 2x2s flourish. Maybe do like a 6x, I don't know. 2x2 was already for me as like a political theorist rather than a sociologist or like a more social scientist. I was like, wow, this is getting new territory. But next time, more angles maybe. I actually have some questions. I want to talk more about, what, I guess, where we could take the, I find like your chapter is so great at laying out what I think is a very complex position in the state debate, and one that I find kind of like formally and theoretically very compelling, and yet like really struggle with politically because it just feels very, like as with a fair amount of like Marxist work that's very compelling. Like that's just sometimes the challenge is like, you're like, okay, analytically, this is formidable. It's like a set of challenges, and it feels very hard to know like what you do or how. And I think that's particularly acute for me in thinking about, again, like the kind of climate urgency stuff, which I know you've also thought a lot about, and how you try to approach that. Like, okay, I find this analytically compelling, and yet like I feel like we like can we try to way forward, or is it kind of lead to that kind of more potentially fatalist position? I guess if you have a theory, if you buy the kind of O'Connor second contradiction thesis, then there's a little bit more of an out. But I actually worry a bit that like Jason Moore's recent work is kind of resting very hard on like this is this is the epochal crisis, and like that's kind of the political mechanism for him. For example, Nancy Fraser has a crisis theory, but it's a little less, she has more of a political argument in it. Anyway, I'm just curious to hear you think about that, because it's always been my struggle with this realm.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, lots to talk about here. I think I think the first thing to say is simply I think that sometimes I feel that sometimes it's important just to sit with it. That like the mood at the end of a critique it's a bummer, and it's a common objection to form analytic theory that it's gloom and doom, or if you want to put it in a different register, that it's too structuralist, it's too determinist, or it's a different kind of determinism, even if it is not a sort of mechanicist determinism that we see in more traditional Marxist theories. And so at a sort of global theoretical level, I think what I want to say is I want to touch on Raju Das's distinction between structural theories of the state and class struggle theories of the states. And I know that it's not meant to be interpreted as a sort of like dichotomy, but I actually really want to press on that point and say that there can be no dichotomy. So in the traditions that I'm invoking in my chapter and the claims that I'm trying to articulate, it's really important not to see social forms as these sort of like ponderous structures that are just sort of there. They're the forms that are assumed by the real activity of concrete social individuals, but in turn they also go on to shape and mediate that activity. And so on the one hand, they're made. They're not found. They're made, and what can be made can be unmade. And so it's not a mechanical conception of history that's in play here. That's sort of like you're trapped within. Max Weber called capitalism an iron cage, and if we want, we can read that as a superstructuralist analysis, and that's not what I'm going for, and that's not how I see it. What I see is that at this moment, ours is a society that's dominated by social categories of our own creating, and it's a weird and inverted society where objects that are created by people come to dominate those people, and it's not simply a metaphor. It's a really weird society that we live in, where no one in particular is telling you to do this, but if you don't go out and get money, you don't eat. And like if you want to call that a structure, fine, but it's what it is it's, as I see it, it's the abstract domination of the particular social forms of social relations that arise out of historical activity. And I emphasize historical activity again because I want to stress that like these forms value the state, the value forms, commodities, money. These are they're not timeless categories. They're made and they can be unmade. And what I'm about to say, I find some people find it to be a cop-out, but I don't think that it's the task of the critique of political economy to deliver strategic proposals. I do think that it's the task to interpret struggles that are happening, and also to, hopefully to look for possible moments in the totality of capital where future struggles might erupt, and what can be learned from them, and how we can better understand the stakes, and how we can better understand what it is that we're struggling against. What I like about the 2x2 chart in your chapter is that it does sort of like force these questions on what can otherwise often be, certainly often be seen as a very abstract, even sort of involuted exercise in critics' eyes, it looks like so much logic chopping. I do think that it's on most days, it's something that causes me to feel very pessimistic. That doesn't sort of diminish my anger, my horror at the urgency of capital-induced climate change. But I do think that the claims that I'm making and the traditions that I'm reaching to, looking at for theoretical resources to build my arguments, they do force us to confront what we're up against, and like it's an incredibly steep climb. And I think that just means that it's incumbent on all of us not to give up thinking hard, give up attending to actual concrete struggles that are happening on the ground, and the task of interpreting these things, and the task of learning lessons, and collectively amassing knowledge and understanding just never stops being important. Again, maybe this is a deeply unsatisfying answer. One thing I will say is that from the critical traditions that I'm drawing inspiration, it's just not the case that at the end of a critique that they're going to discharge policy positions or recommendations for institutional design. And we might think that perhaps that's a limitation. I'm going to stop there and see if perhaps we get. I suspect that I'll get asked more questions along these lines in the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I actually totally agree with like much and probably most, maybe all of it. Like, I think I agree. It's not the it's not the job of critique to sort of present the entire alternative or the program or anything like that. And I think it is extremely clarifying, even if often like stringently so. And and certainly we shouldn't be like developing analyses in service of political goals, which I think can be very distorting. And I feel like often like I'm sympathetic to some projects that like are kind of like, you can see where they're reaching certain conclusions because I really want this thing to be like politically useful. And you're like, I feel you, but it's not, it can end up being, ultimately, I think it's not politically helpful to do that. And insofar as it's sort of like, you're like, wishfully thinking your way to an analysis. So I totally don't want to suggest like, well, if it sort of ends up somewhere, grim, it's like there's something wrong with it. But I guess it's sometimes I think, I do find, I think it's, so part of it is like, maybe just like on some level, just feeling like a level of like wanting to resist certain conclusions that I also like find myself drawing quite a lot. And, I know also like, I also really like felt a lot of what you were saying earlier in your response to Sean, and just like the kind of like disorientation of living in a society where you're told you're an agent, you're free, you're all of the stuff, and then like looking around and you have control over nothing, and you like the stark limitations of that, as well as just like especially as a fellow political theorist, like to sort of not only feel that in daily life, but then to like look at the field of study that's supposedly asking these questions and feel like something really significant is sort of missing from a lot of those analyses in terms of like what actually are, what the state's doing and how and why, is really, like it's sort of bizarre how much like Marxist state theory has just like vanished from mainstream political theory, as like Raphael's work shows really well. But in any case, yeah. So I think there's like, I'm totally sympathetic to all of this. I think, but one question I do have, and maybe we can talk more about, like, I don't want to, we should open up to Q&A too, but is thinking about like, I think your positioning of like, of Will and Werner's ideas at the end, the kind of idea of like, whether the state, I'm trying to find the quotes, but like, is the state, the armed and servile agent of capital versus it's not an agent of capital. It's sort of like, it's emergent from the same social relations and also from the same sort of problem of value. And I find it also like sort of your critique of the relative autonomy thesis and the kind of that it is this like more parsimonious way of getting to like a, kind of thinking through, not just like, you don't have like multi levels of like, here's like the spheres of society and economy and politics and whatever, which I think can get very, like you just kind of start drawing these arbitrary lines. There's often some like quite confused sort of accounts of how they relate to one another and so on. So I find all that very compelling. And yet, like, I think it's like, what are the specific, that the agent of the state does have a distinctive kind of agency that develops in different ways, that has different kinds of like levers on it, and that like might therefore, whether or not the things that emerge from the social form. And I sometimes wonder about like the language of like form determined, because like, it is the language of determination, and that doesn't have to be determinist exactly, but it definitely points in that direction. And so like, how do we think about, form shaped or form structured or form emergent or something, but like that there's still some, like there's a lot that might emerge in ways that like capital actually doesn't, certainly capital doesn't control, but that even like sort of this, that might have some like, again, like excess or something up beyond the social form. Like, where do we push on those moments? I don't know. So I'm curious what thoughts you have on like, how do we think of like the specificity and distinction of, because I do think sometimes like the derivationist position will kind of like always remind us like it's not autonomous, like not the autonomy of the political, it comes back to it's like the divergence of like of the unity. But there's distinction, there's specificity. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, totally. So much to say there, and actually, maybe starting with the state derivationist is as good a place as any. So, this is a debate that starts in West Germany in the second half of the 20th century, and it's a group of fairly non-traditional Marxists who are attempting to suss out whether or not it's appropriate to think of the state as a category that can be derived from the categories that are discussed in the first few chapters of Marx's Capital. And it's not just of historical interest. It is of historical interest because it's sort of a touchstone for some of the traditions that I'm drawing on in my chapter. But it's also just interesting because it's, the two editors of this volume, State and Capital, they show up in your 2x2 chart, and in the introduction to their volume of Marxist state theory from, I want to say, actually, I have it right here. This was published in 1978. In their introduction, they voice a lot of these concerns about the idea of politicism as sort of like the inverse sin from economism. So if economism is sort of like reducing all social phenomena to having their ultimate origin and ends and everything in the economic, which I think we should distinguish from. I think we should distinguish the economic from, say, value relations, for reasons that I'm happy to go. I'm always happy to go down that rabbit hole, but let's just bracket that for now. The editors of this volume, State and Capital, 1978. Run, don't walk to your nearest bookstore. I'm sure they have many copies in stock. And they articulate some of these concerns about the relative autonomy thesis as sort of being ontologically expansionist and so on. But you said, why form determined, why not form conditioned, form influence? And I have no strong commitments to one term or the other. So so there's a recent book by the philosopher Tony Smith called Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism, which I've found very clarifying in my own thinking on these issues. And he makes the point that there's an incredible amount of variability in the content of state policies, even if the state form is quite specific and quite determinate. And so we can call it a bounded indeterminacy if we want. And that gets us into some juicy dialectical territory of what does it mean for indeterminacy to be bounded? What kind of contradiction is that? He makes the point that there's actually like a huge amount of variability in the possibility of what states can do. And it's not the case that the form of the state determines what the state's going to do. The form of the state establishes some outer boundaries of what it's possible for the state to do and still remain the kind of state that it is. And I think another point to emphasize too is that state personnel don't think in terms of the reproduction of the capital relation. They don't think in terms of securing the conditions for the pursuit of surplus value. They do think about profitability and they do think about revenue. And so they're always making their decisions in a like it's fetishism all the way down. Like they're not looking to secure the conditions for capital accumulation considered as an historically specific form of the reproduction of wealth and the historically specific form of society. They're thinking in terms of it seems to be the case that they think in terms of inflation. They think in terms of unemployment numbers. They think in terms of what they believe is sort of like investor sentiment and what they are told is sort of the state of the markets. And for that reason, we don't see a sort of a neat correspondence between what might be an objective interest of capital and what state policy does. And in fact, state policy is almost always not sort of this is my claim. State policy is almost always not sort of the execution of a class project. It's muddling along and trying to figure out what's going to work under certain conditions and, given certain ideological commitments and ultimately given the constraints that are imposed by the form of the state. I think one good example of empirical work that is sort of guided by this approach is Jack Copley's Governing Financialization, which I think came out in 2022 or 2021. And he uses form analytic theory of the state, drawn largely from open Marxism, to try to understand the transformation of the British economy in the 70s and the 80s, in a phase that's commonly referred to as the financialization of the UK economy. And in Copley's telling, it's not the case that this transition towards being, having a national economy that's dominated by the City of London, a retrenchment in heavy industry and manufacturing. It's not the case that these were things that were determined by the form of the state. They were the things that were possible to do within the constraints of the form of the state. and they appeared to, I mean, they especially appeared to the Tories, given the commitments that they had, to be the ways to go about securing the ends that they wanted to secure. And it's a totally different conversation as to whether or not like this was the best way to actually secure the conditions for continued and expanded capital accumulation. I'm not myself fully convinced that I've responded to you fully in all respects, but given that it's 25 after the hour, I really do want to hear from the comments on the feed.
Thanks for having the discussion, y'all. I'm particularly interested in having this go on between the two of you for the next like 8 hours, 8 months or something like that. Just to pull back for a second, was extremely excited at the emergence of this book project precisely because the state debate, both on the open Marxism side and then the let's say broader public conversation that went back and forth between Miliband and Poulantzas, in and of itself represents one of the best, in my opinion, applied conversations around the structure agency debate, precursor for Marxism that was so alive. One that I think we need to continually revisit, especially today. So to hear you all going back and forth about it, I was kind of glued to the screen here. Very excited by this. We've got a few questions coming in from the chat. Just a reminder to everybody to and we just got a new text message, be sending us in questions, confessions, concerns of any variety. We're happy to have it. I have what I think are a few naive questions. Naive not in the sense that they are not useful so much as I think what I, when listening to these talks, wanted to say is like, what happens if we sort of like look at some particular lenses on some things and see if it elaborates some of the disagreements and commonalities here. One of the ones that I had was particular to both positions that you all have in the discussion, have kind of taken and shared in that space, which kind of harkens back to maybe a broader talk that's been going on over the last 6 months or so around disagreements of the idea of the impersonal. Okay, so like what does impersonal power actually mean? What does that look like? This is not just like a space where it's going on something like Twitter or in places in, for example, like our DSA chapter out here. But I can at least personally attest to the fact that it has taken place on a VFW hall dance floor in Nashville, Tennessee, between me and a Copenhagen resident who has been very invested in this conversation himself. So in the context of impersonalization, right? Like how can we translate impersonal power to the extent that it can be translated into the kinds of politics or activity that we'd like to see expressed, I guess in a certain sense, either contrary to the capitalist state or as sort of movement through it. I only ask that because I feel like you all have kind of touched on a lot of topics that would explain certain factors of like analytical factors that would hearken to or express impersonal power when we're talking about larger institutions, when we're talking not just about specific state institutions, but for example, in reference to Copley's great book on the governance of financialization. But we could also look to something, for example, like Daniela Gabor's argument that there's been a shift from the Washington consensus to the Wall Street consensus. Like in both of these instances, what we have is something that really clearly shows some kind of agency or agency adjacent activity that comes about or is an expression of a state logic or something that entrenches or re-entrenches a state capitalist logic. So I think what I'm trying to get at is there a way to think about this question of impersonal power? Not so much in all of the forces that I would assume most of the people watching today are against, so much as difficulty or potential orientations for navigating the difficulties of the things that we would like to see in the short term. That's probably really, really vague, but and I'm happy to clarify wherever, but yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense.
All right, I'll go first, or at all if you don't want to, Alyssa. So I think that there are several questions going on in there. I think one is that it's just incumbent upon us, and especially me, since I think I used the phrase several times in my presentation, what is meant by impersonal power. I mean, at the most abstract sense, in the ways of elaborating a critique of capitalism that I'm interested in, impersonal domination, abstract domination, objective domination, choose your flavor. These are terms that attempt to capture something that's peculiar about unfreedom in capitalism, which is that it's not the case that the unfreedom that we experience is always or necessarily the consequence of another will. So if you're a feudal peasant, you know exactly who's dominating you and to what end. But if you're a capitalist subject and you discover that in order to go on living, you have to buy commodities with money, and you have to get that money by selling your labor power, that's a deep form of compulsion, but nobody in particular is doing that to you. It's still the product of human activity because, as I've claimed, it's a consequence of historically specific categories mediating our society and its reproduction, and those categories get constituted through real, concrete historical activity. But nevertheless, there's no one in particular who's telling you you must get a job. I mean, yes, of course, like perhaps there are specific conversations or circumstances where people in your life are telling you need to do that or you must do that, but it's not part of a pattern of overall social domination. That is an attempt at a gloss at impersonal power at the most abstract level. Then there's the impersonal power of the state, which is related, but we can talk about it maybe in a different level of abstraction. And here I think it's important to talk about what specifies the, I hate reusing the word specificity so much, but what specifies the specifically capitalist state? And part of it is that it's a state that exercises impersonal rule or impersonal power. It does not, in the ordinary run of things, it does not work explicitly and exclusively and for a long duration for the benefit of particular individuals. And it doesn't encounter subjects as real individuals, but as abstract citizens who have the formal equality and freedom of contract in Marx's paradise of let me see if I get this right. It's freedom, equality, property in Bentham, or something like that. And this really sharply distinguishes states in our world society today from those in previous societies that have existed before our own. In terms of this really intriguing question of the transition from impersonal power to I guess what I'd say transition toward the empowerment of real people in the co-direction of their own shared social life, I'm going to throw up my hands and say that's the $64,000 question, isn't it? Like, I think there's a real there's so much open space in the Marxist critique of the state to think harder about what the institutional mediation of an emancipated society would look like. Certainly, I make the case that it's not going to be anything like what we have now. I'm on record as saying that you can't transplant the state that we have into a society that has abolished the value form, because in so doing, you would also have abolished the form of state that is specific to that society. And I think that there's a need for a lot of additional work along these lines. I also think that this is a case where an attentiveness to actual concrete struggles on the ground is essential, and is going to continue to be so. I mean, at a bare minimum, if you want to empower people to have, even if not decisive, but just really palpable, tangible, immediately visible influence over the course of their own lives and the lives that they share with the other people around them, then you need to figure out a different way to organize production. It's because what we have right now is not production for the sake of needs. It's production for the sake of the pursuit of surplus value, production for the sake of production. And that production only gets validated through money-mediated exchange. And the challenge is to figure out ways to validate production before it happens, through the inclusion of all of the people affected. And if this sounds incredibly vague, it's because I am being incredibly vague, because I would love to know how to go about proposing that and pursuing it. And I don't know. Alyssa, you tell me.
Good handover. Where's the answer to the $64,000 question? I don't have the answer, as I'm sure everyone will be very surprised to hear. But I'm gonna maybe just riff a little bit on what some of Rob was saying, which was such a great overview of how to think about impersonal power. And I have now kind of forgotten some of Sean's initial question, but I'll go with it. And I think, I guess I would just say, I think understanding, these impersonal forms of power and domination is so important. And I don't want to say but, and also understanding the ways that those are often sometimes and often mediated by more direct forms of power and domination. And, like Marxist feminists write about with the family, but I think there are a lot of versions of this that kind of deviate from the kind of stylized view of capital. And you have the kind of your compulsion to work, and you have the kind of if you don't work, you don't eat, and things like that. And that is absolutely, I think, the underlying and essential feature of domination and capitalist class society. And yet there that often there might be in places where you don't have political theorists tend to focus on workplace domination or domination of employed by employer. But maybe you don't have a job, and so you're accessing the wage through a family member. Maybe you don't have a wage or a family, and so you're accessing some kind of welfare provision through the state. Maybe you're kind of just totally scrapping around for informal work, and kind of totally at the mercy of the market without even the mediation of the employer, who has some form of kind of authority over you. So I think one thing that I think seems important and exciting to do as we're kind of turning to think about these really important questions of power and domination is the mapping some of the array of them, and trying to understand that again these two are products of these are sort of emanating from the sort of, what is a basic kind of structural feature of capitalism, but like they might look different, and they might have these other kinds of relationships that are like they're often again like mediated by other kinds of relationships, and so thinking about those I think is important, and some things we're also thinking about like the state as one of these kinds of like like forms of authority and power that that like can structure some of these like relationships that people have to one another and to like their means of subsistence and so on, especially where capital sort of like just like abandoning both like people, nature's like entire aspects of of like things that are just like not that are not likely to be profitable, or that are not going to produce surplus value. Like there are a lot of places where like that's where the sort of the state comes in, and so how do we think about that? I guess I'd say I don't have an answer to sort of like what what things will look like or how we get there. But maybe I'll put in a pitch for like the good side of impersonal power, impersonal rule. Like I think maybe this is a case for me of like where I maybe want some sublation, because there are things about impersonal power that I'm like, great, like I would love to have some impersonal power not in service of domination, or like where like the kind of idea of the abstract citizen and equality and all of these things that are kind of like often a veil over like a more foundational inequality. But I think remain good ideas in many respects, with like problematically so and like kind of imperfectly so. And there's no such thing as I don't think we have to believe in an idea of like perfect abstract citizenship and equality to sort of want to to hang on to some aspects of the kind of like I don't know, like abstract equality of human beings that like whatever form that might take in our in our sublated world to come.
I just want to jump in and say I think that last point is really important. Like the alternative to impersonal power is not like hyperpersonal power, because like we if we want an example of sort of in your face domination, like we can look to the family for example, which is a totally fraught and not at all sort of like it's not an image, a prefiguration of what an emancipated society would look like. So I think the point about sublation is really crucial. Like just more generally, like thinking about just imagining the aspects of an emancipated society and what they would look like. It's just not part of the Marxist tradition to think that, well, you achieve that through sort of like designing it ahead of time and de novo, and not without reference to concrete historical circumstances. So I think it's really important that Alyssa's sort of like bringing us back down to historical circumstances that are not of our own choosing, such that, the transformation of the capitalist state is going to be really, really weird and scary.
To say the least, I think we're witnessing its outlines currently, and it's, to borrow a very old phrase, stranger than fiction could ever afford. What we're seeing in the world today. So I'm doing exactly what I said I wasn't going to do, which is I'm going to combine a couple of questions that I have that came in, but I think it makes sense a little bit between the context. And I'll have another question after that, and we'll close up. Speaking of the historical context that both of you have been pointing to within this talk today, kind of part of the question has been one of not just a sort of analytical periodization, but the like active trying to assess what is going on here and now, the purpose that we all find ourselves sort of continuously thrown into periodizations, which is this new? What's new? What's old? Is this old? Etc. One of the things I was struck by between both of your talks and then through this discussion is that there is a historically, by and large, unprecedented form that all of us are enduring today, which is that we can say that there have been previously and many times over, periods of globalizing and globalization in these sort of microcosms of earthen existence and living. Yet, I mean, over the 20th century in particular, and clearly in the 21st century, we have not hitherto had an experience of modes of governance, of law, of capitalist market, etc., that are simultaneous and co-present across such a great swath of not just the planet, but at this point, are exoplanetary. Like the amount of activity over the last, I'd say something like 17, 18 years, trying to figure out who can stake what legal claim to what kinds of minerals that can be assessed in asteroids and other meteoric bodies out in the Kuiper Belt. It's absurd. It's like it's not even some kind of science fiction that we're all akin to. It's something that is growingly more like legal fiction on television, with its like very particular technical nuances. And so, on the one hand, I think it's important to say that we do and can point to our current historically unprecedented conditions that we as a species and also as a classed species and with a class history are having our legs stretched more than we are stretching our legs out into further reaches of the solar system. But why that matters is particularly in a context where it has to do with claims on property, social property relations, what we can do or can't do as far as productive, what is the current technical productive reach of either the species or the historical juncture at large. The only reason that I'm bringing this up is because there's a way in which, but like looking at this sort of juncture that has been returned to between structure, agency, between capitalism as a state mode versus the kind of subjects that it sort of cleaves into civil society, is being forced into a more globalized, or I guess you could say like a universalized particular condition today, right? Like the sheer globality, the scale of globality, the physicality of capitalism's global reach has we have no idea where it can go currently. And I am asking that in a strange way, in a weird roundabout way, to try and get back at a question about law, a question about property. What do you all see as maybe factors or conditions that, let's say, not, well, we're mostly talking with socialists and communists and anarchists. So, I mean, what should these movements and these persons be focusing on as far as short-term trajectories, anticipations, political motivations, for example, in regards to how aspects of international capital is legally stretching its legs, and then just maybe conversely with that, how do we actually, I guess I would say, let's just not limit it also to socialist movements or what have you, but what do you think, if possible, we'll be facing in the immediate short term from apparatuses of governance that will be sort of mandating our material lives and the legal scope that they hold? I don't know. Again, very large questions. Really sorry.
I mean, I think that they will continue to face increasing and accelerating repression. And I say the following not in a sense of this is me telling social movements what to do, but just as a sort of an evaluation based on how I understand the capitalist state and capitalist law, which is that I think it seems to me the most important thing for transformative social movements to be thinking with respect to law is knowing it so as how to best maneuver around it, and knowing it so as how best to protect people when they are caught in the jaws of repression. And I say the following not as the result of any sort of like sophisticated analysis, but like things are getting scarier, and it really seems like the intensity and the scope of repression is widening, and it's and it is also the case that capitalism is a world market society, and the legal form is sort of co-constitutive with and co-present with the value form everywhere. And I mean, one thing that I was thinking about while you're asking your question, Sean, was sort of intellectual property claims to particular crop cultivars, and the diminution of biodiversity even within the scope of those species which have been so thoroughly dominated by human sociality so as to become crops. I mean, we're losing pockets of biodiversity all over the place in the face of the expansion of capitalist monocultures and the subordination of ever greater like physical swaths of the planet to agriculture, and tying up more of what's left of ecological systems into agriculture and livestock. And so I, again, this is not the result of any sort of like furrowing my brow and really cogitating for a long time. My gut response is to say that it seems like, yeah, ours is a world with lots and lots of law, and where capital moves in search of opportunities for investment, there too you will find the presence of a specifically capitalist law, and it poses a real challenge that can't be ignored. So how's that for doom and gloom?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely echo that. I think certainly it's very pertinent to climate activism and environmental activism, and thinking back to the 90s, the environmental activism was the number one, the primary domestic terror threat in the U.S. Like, the Green Scare saw the infiltration of environmental organizations by the FBI, and, surveillance through the kinds of practices that COINTELPRO used, and the increase in legal penalties and all of this stuff. So it's, there's both precedent for that, and we're seeing also like a ramping up of charges for, interference with what they now call critical infrastructure in U.S. law. Penalties for like not only, certainly not even like blowing up a pipeline, but if you're like walking around a pipeline at the wrong time and somebody sees you and they think you look suspicious, then you might be, like liable for charges. There's obviously been, in the U.S. again, sort of the struggles over Cop City near Atlanta, where sort of an instance of both challenge to like the repressive force of the state and to sort of the environmental damage that was going to accompany the building of this facility, but also sort of demonstrated state repression and action. And so I think there's a lot more where we're going to see like these kinds of charges and domestic terrorism charges and all of these things coming down the pipeline. So I think, yeah, countering repression is like absolutely essential. The other thing I wanted to say, though, and this is maybe less about law, but I think in the context of like a kind of planetary galactic capitalism, whatever it is. Like, there are real problems for capital with that too. Like, I mean, there are real problems for everyone organizing against it, because I do think some people don't like talking about collective action problems on the left, but I do think there are real collective action problems for those of us who would like to challenge capital, and those grow larger, the sort of the more distance and sort of like both geographic and cultural and temporal and all these things between people who are who like might otherwise sort of organize together. But there are real, I think the lack of a planetary state is a challenge for if like part of the function of the state is to like states do things for capital. Like there are multilateral organizations and like trade deals and treaties and things like that like obviously are sort of ways of working around this. And so far those have been kind of the only really enforceable forms of like international law, basically. But I do think there are some real like challenges around. I mean, for example, if you think that climate change is if you think it's like an actual threat to capital, and it's that like states would have an interest in challenging it, like states are having a pretty hard time doing some of that work. And so I think that we should maybe, I don't know necessarily what sort of follows from that immediately, but I think it's interesting to think about where are the places where, in a Marxist theory of the state, we might think, well, when XYZ happens, and you see this all the time, actually, like so much kind of like so much of like environmental economic theory, political economy is around the idea of like the externality of public goods, things that like are kind of not going to be provided by the market, so the state has to provide. But like that is often very challenging on a global planetary scale. So there are places where like states, and I think most Marxist state theorists would recognize that there are places where the state might try to do something and fail, and that they're the fact that like states are oriented towards doing certain things doesn't mean they'll succeed in them. And that doesn't necessarily present an opportunity, but it's something I think interesting for us to think about and try to theorize around and like strategize around a little bit, like where are states sort of like not doing what capital needs them to do. And I actually think there's a lot of those places right now, frankly, and also where capital isn't sometimes doing what you'd expect in terms of everyone's like, why does the state have to de-risk everything to think of like Danielle Gabor's work? Like, why isn't capital supposed to be taking risks? Like, why is suddenly capital like floating around, not taking, like, why are we not seeing investment? All these kinds of questions, which are like a whole other kind of forms. But, I think there's a lot of places to kind of try to figure out what does that mean? What do we do with that? I doubt we'll kind of be in a position. I'm always very curious, like this is going on such another tangent, but I can't like what happens when Elon Musk tries to build his Mars colony? Like what is the governance structure there? Who on earth would do that? But like, there's a lot more to think about. So, but I'll stop.
I have too much to say about Elon Musk on Mars, but I'm gonna just hold that back for everyone's sake. That would be a great misfortune for all of us, for me to go on about that. I have one last question for y'all. I asked this with Jasmine and Nate, and I'm curious what you all have to say. The book, the collection is called Marxism in the Capitalist State, Towards a New Debate. So on the one hand, I'm just curious what you all might see as something like a new debate. Is it carrying over the old debates, or is it a refounding of something totally new? And on the other hand, just what you all are hoping to get out of this really rich and fascinating collection of essays that you put together.
Yeah, I can start, and then Rob can kind of close us off, since you did know like a lot of the real conceptual work behind it. So I guess I would just say, I think the different pieces in the volume do kind of a range of things, from like recovering, recovering past debate, sort of rethinking them in the present, applying them, kind of trying to, like figure out what's useful, what we need to do. I do think there's a lot of work that, I think it's a very exciting moment to be trying to both, go back to, like, it seems to me that like Marxist state theory in general has always developed like in these kind of historical conjunctures and like in these conjunctural moments. And so is both like very illuminating, I think, to look back to, these debates from 60s and 70s, or that began then and then kind of have carried on. But, there's also obviously like things that we might need to think about differently or rethink in our present moment. And so I think it's a very, I hope people will sort of get both of those things out of the volume, I guess, is like both like I think it's a very good, primer on some of the kinds of like, here are some of the core questions, debates, ideas, like the stakes of those debates, but also like pushing them forward and like kind of posing them to our present moment and to sort of the challenges they face since reevaluating, doing all this kind of work. And so I think it's just like, so like I said, like really incredibly important stuff that we we're really overdue for kind of rethinking a lot of this to understand like what sort of we face on the left, like how capitalism is developing and transforming in ways today, or like how to understand sort of the ways states are acting without kind of saying per your previous comments, John, either we're in something totally new or this is all just like the same old, same old. And so I think the book hopefully can start to do some of that. It's also just a very fun, wonderful volume. So I will not say buy it because it's very expensive, but get your library to buy it and order it through your institutions, whatever institutions you have, or like, something. So so thank you. I hope people will get something out of it.
That was great. I endorse everything that Alyssa just said. I mean, going back to somebody said sublation earlier, and towards a new debate means bringing in the new, but also recovering and transforming the old. We do definitely reassess old debates, and they're not just of antiquarian interest. They are of enduring interest. But yeah, I agree completely that it's notable that Marxist theory seems to have these spurts of generativity and creativity that correspond to particular historical processes, historical moments. And yes, I agree. We're overdue for new understandings. And in terms of answering your question, Sean, as it's addressed, or as it's asking us to address the audience, to everybody who's tuning in or watching the recording, what I would say is don't be satisfied with paint by numbers stories about what the state is and how it works. By all means, look to the classics, but also the space is wide open, and we are trying to with this volume and with the incredible work that all of the contributors have done, we're trying to open up that space and explore it and more fully inhabit it and improve our understanding of the capitalist states. And yes, I do think that there's something of a lack right now in terms of having enough state theory that's adequate to our moment, and this is our contribution towards redressing that. And also just let me take this opportunity once again to thank Sean and everyone at Red May, and my co-presenter Alyssa, and thank you to our audience members. This has been great.
Seconded. Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thank you, Mahim. Thank you, everyone. It's been awesome.
This is your rodeo. I'm merely your rodeo clown, and just absolutely happy to be such a thing. And hopefully nobody else was speared by any bulls out there or tossed about. I know I signed up for that, and I'm always happy to do it. I'll take that up with my therapist. Anyway, this has been part 2 of our Red May's July series on Marxism and the Capitalist State Towards a New Debate. Again, a great collection of texts, extremely thought-provoking stuff. It traces a tremendous history, that an analytical history, that I can't recommend enough for just anybody to pick up and not just absorb, but also take back out into the world, live through that critique, feel it in your bones, and address your world today. We are with Rob Hunter and Alyssa Battistoni. Thank you all so much for joining us today and participating with us. This has been another edition of Red May. If you like the stuff that you've seen today, feel free to check out more on our YouTube stream. Again, most of our events are available there for free at youtube.com/redmaytv. And then, you know, if you're like, well, this is pretty okay stuff, I think this is very interesting, and you know, I wonder how I can contribute. We have a volunteer form on our website, redmayseattle.org. We are always taking people. Currently, we're taking a lot of people from all over the states and around the world, seeing some very strange and exciting expansion. And we would love to have you contribute to that. Additionally, if you're like, I don't want to put in any time, life's hard enough as it is, you can contribute with a little bit of cheddar. You can go subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/redmayseattle. We have plenty of fresh content there and are creating a whole slate of new material that'll be available there first. Again, I am Sean Landis. This is Alyssa Baston and Rob Hunter, and you have been watching Red May. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.